It gives me great pleasure to introduce Peter Neumann, who probably doesn't need much introduction, but as he says in the programme, his first interest was in ants, and he then studied genetics and got particularly interested in the small hive beetle, which he continues to work on. Since 2008, he has run the COLOSS Association, which grew from a very small group of European scientists working on the reasons why honeybee colonies should be dying in such large numbers. And COLOSS has gone on from strength to strength over the years and now has some 2,000 members in nearly 200 countries around the world. And all those people are bee scientists, specialists, and advisors, all working together to try and understand why honeybee colonies may die off. So I think Peter is uniquely qualified to talk about the breadth of threats to our honeybees globally. So Peter Neumann.
Thank you very much, Norman, for the very kind words. Thanks for the invite. I'm also happy that Vita Bee Health is supporting the meeting. And I would like to start with a bit of a philosophical question. What do you want? I think that is something important when we keep bees. I should be ask ourselves really, what is the reason why we're helping bees? And what can we then in this background do? And, I would like to give you a bit of a detour here. When you're keeping dogs, you can keep all kinds of different dogs, look fluffy and nice and so on. But there may be issues with some of the dogs you keep. And other dogs, are not facing such issues. So maybe we need to reconsider this also in terms for our bees. But again, just like if you're keeping dogs, you can of course do whatever you want with your bees because they're yours. I would like to mention two, there are other exceptions, but two I would believe noteworthy exceptions. Number one is there are mandatory bee diseases. I'm not 100% sure about the legal situation in the UK, but in Switzerland, when you're having these little mites, Tropilaelaps, in your apiary or Velutina tomida, you have to immediately tell the officials, and the government vets will come and have to clarify the situation. Another one is what I call mite volcanoes, over here, yeah. So if you're not really taking care of your bees or something is going wrong in your apiary, you may spread mites to your neighbors, and that will not maybe so appreciated by your neighboring beekeepers. This is something like we should be always considered when we talk about the hive of our bees. Well, the neighboring beekeepers may be in trouble too. Then, I would like to take you to Brazil. I was doing field work in the famous city of Pindamonhangaba. This Indian, that means the place where they make canoes. And it's about 2-hour drive away from Rio de Janeiro. And, I was opening a colony and I felt immediately in love. It was such a beautiful colony, you won't believe it. It was great. The queen was doing extremely well. The brood nest was a dream, very solid. There were no shark brood. There were no crippled bees. It's like basically taken from an Eva Crane textbook. That was how a beekeeping colony should look like. And, when you look into your colonies in Switzerland, it's unfortunately looks quite different. So, and this colony had smaller beetle and Velutina tomida and mites. And the colony was nevertheless absolutely okay. And I guess from my little love story from Brazil, we may also learn for other places. And so this colony is doing extremely well despite these two major pests. And so the point is, what are the challenges overall for honeybees globally? And what can we as beekeepers, what can we really do about it? All right, let's start with something which is ubiquitous, maybe not in the US, but in other places globally. We have climate change. And I think there is very solid data that the weather and the climate are changing overall. And this has, I believe, a couple of consequences for us. Global warming is causing more intense storms. We have droughts in summer. Well, for example, now in Germany, there's actually no rain going on in March, which I had to water my pot plants a lot in the balcony. And we have extreme weather events, which happened in the past, but they seem to be more frequent, like including natural disasters, for example, flooding or like droughts or fires. So we believe we need a strategy. Everybody has a rough feeling what we can do, but I think we have to develop jointly a strategy what we can do to face climate change and to help bees and actually us as their keepers. So one issue, which is actually quite obvious, that there will be increased nutritional stress for colonies. That includes need more feeding. So I have a question for the audience. Who of you has fed your bees in summer already? Please, hands up. Don't hesitate. Hands up. Who is you feeding your bees in summer? All right. Thank you very much. I've done the same. So, and who of you is regularly feeding bees in summer, meaning like every summer and maybe even more than once? Any one of you had to do that already? Okay. Well, if you ask the same question in other countries, like for example in Greece or in Italy, beekeepers have to more often feed their colonies in summer. In Sicily, for example, in June, July, there is no flowering going on and the bees need regularly food. So if you go talking about this food and the feeding, something you are what you eat is something you may have heard already talking for us. We are supposed to have a healthy diet, lots of vegetables and fruits. And the same is true, of course, for bees. When we're having here a feeder in a hive, and when we feed them, the bees should get macronutrients, meaning they need sugar and proteins. In terms of the proteins, like ideally having all essential amino acids that the bee colonies need. And for example, the answer to all pollen questions in a honeybee seems to be 4. So even if you, when I work with bees in oilseed rape fields, we can be quite big. And you open the colonies, I'm amazed, like, you know, that you can see in the, when you have the brood nest and the pollen around, you can see from the color, the bee really try hard to get pollen, even though the field, the oilseed rape field is fairly big. Right? They put a lot of effort, the bees, to get pollen from different sources, even though they have to travel further away. Another thing which is often kind of like neglected is micronutrients, so vitamins and minerals. So when we sugar, put it bluntly, sugar water is not enough. So we need to get the bees a better food. And that is something like, again, we're having some comparison with humans, like a whole foods. So if we have to feed the bees, then we should give them like adequate food. And sorry, a bit of a joke here. We have a lot of fake honey producers and they may give out advice, yeah. One thing I would like to raise is we did some experiments in this regard in Bern, like to students of mine and myself, and we had some bad experience with vitamins. You have to be really careful if you play around about the vitamin dosages. Don't give too many vitamins because the bees, yeah, they were behaving really strangely. They were nervous and it didn't look good. So they seem to be poisoning when they are in too high amounts. All right. Oh, hello. Welcome to Pest Party. Please note the 6 A's in the title, yeah? So, and this is something, you know, when we're having the shorter broodless periods and the warmer climate, it will foster the usual suspects. These are like parasitic mites, smaller beetles, and invasive wasps. And I had a word with Norman Carrick, like it was a couple of months or years ago even, that very often you have brood like throughout the winter in UK. And also like now in Switzerland, Germany, and other places, you know, the brood fur period is indeed shorter. And then it's kind of obvious, as soon as there's brood in the hives, the mites can reproduce. So this will likely get things worse with the situation we're facing here with those pests. And another thing is, maybe some of you have seen that famous headline of the New York Times back in 2007, bees vanish and scientists race for reasons. And I had the pleasure, I was actually working in Beltsville back in the days, and that was together with Jeff Pettis and Jay Evans, Judy Chen, in the Beltsville Bee Lab. And that was no fake news. I saw the colonies. The colonies had no damaging levels, damaging what we say, lowish number of mites, no high incidence of nosema either. And nevertheless, the colonies died really rapidly. That was quite impressive. And seems to be the case in April 2025. So we may have a bit of a deja vu. So there are some reports. We have no really published papers about it, but I spoke to beekeepers and to colleagues. There seem to be high and sudden losses, like professional beekeepers having like hundreds of hives lose 60 to 80%, which is incredibly high. And the mite numbers seem to be lowish again. So that, when you look in bottom boards and counting your mites, the colonies dying had no exceptional high mite numbers. So maybe CCD Empire Strikes Back. You may know the old movie back in the days from Star Wars. And CCD, that's colony collapse disorder. And I believe there were a couple of papers on it, including in legal journals, but I believe that colony collapse disorder has not been properly understood. And it disappeared eventually. So suddenly you never heard about these cases anymore. One reason is that people, when it was not trendy anymore or not so easy to understand, that the people are not looking in detail for the clinical field symptoms. But we may now witness the return of CCD. That wouldn't be so pleasant. So there are no data at the moment out there from the United States. I personally believe that viruses are most likely underlying this point. Again, it could be that the viruses have changed their transmission efficacy. For example, we know that several of the bad viruses, like, for example, deformed wing virus, are heavily dependent upon varroa mites for transmission. It could well be that the viruses are less dependent upon varroa and can then spread in the colony and do disaster, whatever. Again, it's a bit of a mystery so far what's going on. And so I recommend please stay tuned what's currently going on in the US. I hope that we hear soon from American Bee Journal or other sources what is actually going on. Another one, which you may have noticed already, we have a new guest in Europe. The Tropilaelaps mite, which is native to Asia, has an obscure report from Africa. But this is here the first report of the Tropilaelaps mites in Europe. It made at least 2 winters. It was Tropilaelaps mercedese. We checked the genetics in our lab, so it definitely the species here. And it made at least 2 winters in Western Russia. So they are able to make a winter, and the winter in this part of Russia is still more severe than it is in other areas of Europe. I believe it's a matter of time, a question of time, until these mites will be in the rest of Europe. So I guess we should be really prepared for Tropilaelaps to come. And I guess dealing with mites will be even more important than it is right now. I have experience working in China and in Thailand, and the colleagues having both Tropilaelaps and varroa. The life is more difficult for us and the bees. But and there's something like I call the Italian mystery. So I'm working with small hive beetle now since 1997. And so I was a bit unpleasantly surprised when smaller beetles appeared in southern Italy. And they are now there for more than 10 years. And you have a map of Italy with red dots and pink dots where they're positive, was reported, green dots with showing negative apiaries. This is, you see the southern tip of Italy plus Sicily. And so it seems to be that there's a very good control overall. Our Italian colleagues seem to do a very good job. There's, for example, a strict ban of migratory beekeeping. And the 3 illegal outbreaks outside of that zone we are aware of were in all cases beekeepers who transported hives illegally out of the containment zone. Only 3 cases in 10 years. I think that's remarkably low. But if you compare that here to the United States, you have here on this little picture, you see the states. You're having North, South Carolina. You have Florida, the states in the southern where the smaller beetle appeared first. And then the next states to be affected were those bordering Canada, because the beekeepers there, they transport colonies for pollination from the south, where the colonies overwinter in Florida. They go up to the north to do pollination. And apparently they had blind passengers. So in the US, it was very quick. Within 10 years, the beetles were also in California. So maybe that ban is so effective, but it's a miracle to me why the beetles are not in Milano or even in Berlin already. So apparently the ban is very, very successful, but still, I don't understand why the beetles have not made it further out of that zone. Then the smaller beetle is also on the march here in Asia. It is rapidly advancing across Asia. There's been reports of Bangladesh. I just talked to colleagues from Thailand, from the Bangkok area. Their smaller beetle is appearing there. And because especially in Southeast Asia, the climate is hot and humid, and this is perfect. It's a smaller beetle basically rearing station. For example, in Florida, smaller beetle has 6 to 7 generations per year. When you go up to Maryland, there may be 1 or 2 generations. So it has a very big impact on the reproduction of the beetle. And what I think is very worrying, when the smaller beetle appeared in China, that was already a few years ago, we have some indications that eastern honeybees, Apis cerana, they seem to be more susceptible than Apis mellifera. And we have no idea why. One reason could be that Apis cerana is overall producing less propolis than Apis mellifera. And one of the defense mechanisms of the bees against the beetles is they put them in propolis prisons. So maybe less propolis is making them more vulnerable. And now when we're having this other beautiful bees in Asia, here, for example, you have, Apis dorsata in the middle and a tiny but very magnificent colony of Apis florea on the right, we have at the moment no clue how vulnerable the other Apis species are against beetle. Maybe we are lucky and the beetle is not doing harm to them. But if the beetle is also harming these other Apis species, then we should really be concerned about conserving the species. So I think the take-home message here is, I think there's a need for concerted action to inform the Asian beekeepers. They can learn from the experienced people in Australia. They are the beetles in Australia now for a long time, over 20 years, and they don't have to reinvent the hive tool in Thailand. And also, we should, given that the beetle is a problem for the wild Apis species, there's a whole bunch of species, according to author, like more than 10. And I think we should definitely take conservation of these honeybee species into account. But now I would like to tell you a little fairy tale, little marvel. So maybe you know that, remember, the Never-Ending Story, beautiful movie of in the 80s. And it's about, basically we can apply that for a pest here. Beekeepers, we apply new substances, the pests evolve resistance. Then we apply new substances and the pests evolve resistance. And that's a forever story. And especially you are well aware of miticides losing effectiveness really quickly. So I guess we need sustainable solutions. And I know it's easy to say and hard to realize, but we should have that goal in mind that these pests we're dealing with, we should have sustainable solutions. And I guess, again, here, my little last story from Brazil, I think we might get an idea how to proceed here. Again, the colony is doing extremely well, despite varroa and smaller beetle in it. And it's not an N=1 observation of Peter Neumann. In fact, when you look at the world map, there are 2 entire continents, Africa and Latin America, where the bees are doing extremely well. I remember a meeting, an Epimondia meeting, where I had a tea with some colleagues from Brazil, and they told me they don't understand all the buzz about these varroa mites because they don't have a problem with varroa in Brazil. So these 2 continents have no problems with mites and beetles, despite zero breeding, or maybe because of zero breeding. And that is also, when we look at populations of susceptible, at least to these mites and beetles, more susceptible populations, for example, in Europe or in America, we seem to have what I call pockets of resistance. For example, the Arnaud forest discovered by Tom Seeley in North America, or the famous Goatland bees from Ingmar Fries, Peter Rosenkranz, and Tony Imdorf, or in France from Yves Lecomte. We have very solid evidence that, European populations are able to live with varroa and the viruses they transmit without treatment. So that can happen. And maybe we need to have some bit of it adjusted beekeeping, like Chiat Blaquier and myself, and also Tom Seeley, actually in the very same year, published little articles on Darwinian beekeeping. So maybe we should a bit more listen to what the bees want and help. And then at the moment when we treat again, it's no sustainable solution. And also, I haven't put a slide in here, there was a meeting in Germany a couple of weeks ago that formic acid and oxalic acid seem to lose their power also in terms of climate change. So, yeah, for example, when you talk to colleagues in Israel, it's extremely difficult to apply formic acid in summer. And so if we're losing this, what I see kind of last resort, then we should really get, other things to go. Maybe some natural selection. We can also try brood stop and things like that. Good. So black box selection, that's something like Chiat developed with Arigomora and a few others, so that we are looking which colonies are doing well, even though they have varroa and virus, and then, rather multiply from this stock than from other. even if with the black box mean we have no really idea, what I believe at least, we know a real idea what the really fundamental mechanisms are, but we look at those colonies which do well and then try to multiply from them. But another thing else, natural disasters. There was a huge flooding in Germany a couple of years ago. And when you talk to beekeepers in Italy or in Turkey and Greece, fires are really a concern. And so wildfire protection, flooding defense, and water security are things we should probably more consider in the future. And I guess there will be, in times of climate change, a need to better protect apiaries. And also if you're a hobby beekeeper, but also especially if you're beekeeping business, you're a professional beekeeper. So maybe we need enhanced insurances for the businesses, sensors, and even a more prudent apiary location. I just had a long discussion with colleagues from Germany that really we need to better see about when flooding has occurred in an area. That's probably not a place to put your hives on, and that needs to be communicated, that people are not kind of blind with respect to the past flooding history of an area. So again, adjusted beekeeping, and you all know a lot about it. Just a few dear suggestions of myself here. When I started to work in the United States back in 2002, I saw for the first time mesh bottom boards, which were not so common in Germany at the time. And I was wondering why they could be useful. Now, after so many years afterwards, I see, first of all, smaller beetle cannot reproduce in the debris of the colonies because they have no debris of the mesh. But even more important seems to be that, that may promote thermoregulation for the bees. When the bees have to keep the hive cool, a mesh bottom board may be helpful. And I had a word with Kirsten Trainer, who worked a lot in US, in Arizona, and in other places where it's very hot, and Nevada area. And they have a special hives where there's a little, between the lid and the top, there is a little space enabling better airflow. So we need maybe to consider how we can help the bees to make thermoregulation easier. Another thing, adequate water supply in apiary used to be important in some places already, but it may become more important in others. When you're having no lake in the close neighborhood, you may give more water to your hives. And I was also quite skeptical about these fancy sensors. Sometimes I can be convinced. A couple of people in a meeting in Germany told me, Peter, we must have that we really know when it's going to hot at our apiary, that we can take action. So I guess in general, it's gentle recommendation that we should reconsider what we're doing for decades and consider to be routine practice in beekeeping. We may wish to reconsider that in light of changing climate. And again, we don't have to reinvent the hive tool. We can talk to people who have that already. For example, beekeepers in southern Italy, they have broodless periods in summer for long times. Now, something completely different. Welcome to the dark side of the force. And you may know that Darth Vader here. And some things you may have noticed already. We as beekeepers seem to be Darth Vaders as well. Why is that the case? The point is, managed honeybees and beekeepers are obviously responsible for the decline of wild bees. Well, I have my problem about this a little bit because in many places of the world, most honeybees are wild in the first place. Anyhow, but go on this. What are the mechanisms here? Competition for food has been suggested as one mechanism underlying this. And I explain that to my students always with a McDonald's example. All right, if we're having 10 clients queuing in front of McDonald's, there are only 8 hamburgers ready. Oh, that's complicated maths. My matric is already a long time ago. But 8 minus 10 equals minus 2. So it's obvious that, that there are 2 bees will not get a hamburger. That is very clear. Another thing is a pathogen spillover. And I would like to take you guys into the London Tube. Imagine you travel in the London Tube. It's a bit crowded. And the neighbor next to you is snoozing like crazy. So 2 days later, you get sick. Or what? Surprise, surprise. So also pathogen spillover is nothing there has been a prominent paper published in Nature almost 10 years ago. And there are many, many, many papers about it, which, again, is not really surprising me that it's happening. I would be surprised if it's not happening, in fact. So, all right, good. So what are the consequences? Beekeeping in natural areas, especially natural conservation areas, must be banned altogether to protect wild bees. That's clear and obvious. Another obvious one is urban beekeeping should be only allowed when there are no wild bees around. And I guess everybody in the audience immediately agrees with that. Maybe not. Maybe not. And why not? The point is, when we look at what are the major drivers of insect decline globally, there is a whole range of factors here. We have a destruction of habitats. We have environmental pollution. I'm actually surprised that there are any insects left when there are tons and tons of neurotoxins and other substances are put in the environment. And we have data for beetles, for my smaller beetles in the ground, that traces of these neonics and other substances reduce the reproduction of these beetles by 50%. That's insane. So again, I'm surprised why we do have any butterflies, moths, and beetles left. Even in nature, in conservation areas, we have concentrations of those. And then we have intensified agriculture in the first place and urbanization. So this is clear. We have lack of nest sites, we have lack of food, and infertility. The male infertility in wild bees, we have data now for bumblebees, but also for solitary bees, that, again, tiny traces of neonicotinoids or other substances reduce the fertilities of the bees big time. So if we compare that now with managed bees and the beekeepers, I see there's a need, an urgent need to see the competition for food, again, the hamburgers and the tube, especially spillover in context with these other stressors. And if you ask me for my personal opinion is that I am convinced that the managed bees are overall not in the top 3 stressors for wild bees. And, you see papers on this issue almost every day. I just read a paper a couple of hours ago where people show that managed honeybees are the key. I guess it's time we need to act on this. And basically, there are a couple of initiatives there. So I believe it's a bit of a storm in a bee cup. So sorry, it is such an easy bash. The honeybees must be responsible, because if we blame everything on honeybees and the beekeepers, we don't have to care about the rest of the factors. So sorry, I believe it's not on. But so what is the suggested strategy for us? What we could do in this regard is, one is, I think, pretty straightforward: more food for all bees. If you have not 8 but 10 hamburgers by McDonald's, every client can have a hamburger. That is clear. So trying to get a lot of food for the bees in the apiaries and in other places. Another one is better health of managed bees. If we get a better grip on varroa in a way or another, and then, of course, the chances for deformed wing virus to spill over to bumblebees or to other bees is less. Another part is what I call beekeeping with a bit of common bee sense. What does that mean? You have a tiny forest in your village, and you put in the tiny forest 100 hives. That is a bit much, all right? So a common bee sense would tell you, maybe in such a forest there would be 3 or 4 colonies naturally. Let's put 3 or 4 colonies into it, but not 100. So that when we're doing our actions, a bit take into account the other bees. That's what I call a common bee sense. And another thing is, I guess really we should focus on joint concerted action against the common stressors. Again, pollution, lack of food and things like that, instead of you are guilty accusation. That is not very helpful. So something like an anthem here, fight separately, but sting together. All right, good. And need for concerted action, like Norman already pointed that out. We have the COLOSS network, and I'm actually very, very happy. COLOSS is a bit of like kind of my baby, yeah. So, and I'm quite happy how it is going well. We're having this organization here with task forces and core projects where we're dealing with all kinds of issues related to colony losses. And I'm quite happy about how it goes, especially the bee book, for example, but also BRAP, Bridging Research and Practice, where Lotta and Linda are connecting very, very closely with the beekeepers. But that's not sufficient. So we should actually go together. The beekeepers and the scientists should work together closely. There was an initiative with Jeff Pettis. Are we trying to get together Apimondia and COLOSS to really connect the beekeepers and the bee scientists closer? And at the end of the day, that's also not sufficient. We should even, we can think about joint fundraising, service and experiments here, when interested beekeepers can join things. But I think we should go even further and think about the non-government organizations, NGOs, and even the general public. Here on the left-hand side, you see a webinar about native bees, and a beautiful native bee is in the back. It's of course a moth or a butterfly, but certainly not a bee. Yeah. And the right-hand side, that was taken a brochure, a European brochure on protection of wild bees. Amazing. It's a hoverfly, not a bee. Yeah. So I guess, we should really be a bit careful about things like that. But the general point is we should get all these people on board, because politicians and policymakers are actually general public. So a bit of a broad thing is here, healthy people need healthy pollinators. So again, we should try to convince a bit more the general public what our bees are doing. The pollination job is so important for us because we need healthy food, vegetables and fruits. That needs pollinators. So not only bees, but also butterflies and hoverflies and things like that. In some areas, also bats and things. So that is a much more general thing. So that rather here joining forces and to ensure pollination for us. I'm coming back to the initial question I told you, what do you want? And the point is like also you may get. And so when I go back to these survivor bees, I worked here in Norway with terrier, and terrier's colonies are a dream. It's so amazingly nice to work with them. They are quite productive and survive varroa without any treatment. That's amazing. And the colonies are still going. But here, not far away, we have the Gotland bees. And the Gotland bees are a bit of a nightmare. They are tiny, they swarm a lot, they're not producing much honey anyhow, but they survive varroa by themselves. So, yeah, can be so and so. And we brought these Norway and Gotland bees, we brought to Bern, and then we learned that the Gotland bees are illiterate. What means they are illiterate? The Gotland bees are not able to read the textbooks. A textbook say a colony must have a certain size to successfully overwinter. So when we had these colonies in Bern, 10 Gotland colonies, 2 of them were really tiny. My students say, Peter, please check it out. And I looked at the colonies. One colony had, I would say, half a frame of bees at most. And another colony of the Gotland bees had 1 frame of bees. And I thought, all right, they'll die. It's part of the experiment. Let's see. Both colonies made it. They survived the first winter on half a frame of bees in a normal Swiss winter. And I was like, wow, it was just mind-blowing how they made it. So here they seem to be experts in thermoregulation, and they do it. But the point I want to make is we're having a bit of here like a Darwinian lottery. So if we let natural selection help the bees to overcome varroa or to cope with varroa, we may not be sure what we get out. We may get terrier bees or we may get the Gotland bees. So one important take-home message was that only locals survive. So the Norwegian bees and the Swedish bees didn't make it, and our Swiss bees made it much better when we had them in our apiary. And in many cases, when we let natural selection work, we may have to make a compromise. Body color, productivity, gentleness, whatever, and survival. So we may not be able anymore to put colonies right next to a school because the bees are a bit alive and kicking and a bit more stinging, but then we don't have less of a problem of varroa. That's a question we all have to answer for ourselves. Are we willing to make a compromise, less productivity, a bit more aggressive, but the bees come through winter better, even with varroa and maybe also with Tropilaelaps? Right, okay. Norman didn't give me a warning, so I seem to be okay in time. I would like to deliver a take hive message. I believe that climate change is a grand challenge for bees and beekeepers. And we need a dedicated strategy. So we should really try to think how we can cope, how the bees and us, how we can better cope with what's coming in the future. Whole foods for bees seems to be something required because we have to feed more, especially also than in summer. When the summer is very dry, like in Sicily right now, then we should give them more than sugar water. But what means more? So there is a lot of research to be done to understand what the whole foods for bees. Could also think about leaving more honey in colonies. That would be something to consider. And we need sustainable solutions for the usual suspects. For the mites, varroa is already here. Tropilaelaps will come, and then also the others, viruses and things. Natural disaster defense. I'm certainly not someone who has a lot of experience in this regard, but I see the need that we will have more issues, probably with flooding or with droughts or fire, also even like in the Mediterranean places. And it would be good to work together. So I think this current basically conflict, or honestly really a conflict going on between the managed bees, honeybees, and the other bee community is detrimental. It is not really helpful. We should really work together and focus on those factors, stressing all bees, in fact, all pollinators, and not only managed honeybees or wild bees. That is probably much more promising to solve it than at the moment when managed honeybees and the wild bee community are working not together. All right, good. Then here, these 3 points are probably, I consider, quite important, but we should think honestly, how can we improve supplementary feeding of the hives? How can we better deal with the usual suspects, getting away from medication? And how can we cope with whatever natural disasters are coming, storms and so on? But I'm a very positive and forward-looking person, so I believe we have a happy end at the day, because like here, together we will win. I'm pretty convinced about this. When the beekeepers and the bee scientists, when we're closer together, we have a very good chance to deal with all the challenges which are coming. Especially also, I noticed that there are a lot of young people are becoming beekeepers, and also there are a lot of young scientists doing bee work. So I'm very positive that we find whatever solutions to keep beekeeping fun and to keep our bees healthy. Thank you very much for your kind attention. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, we'll take questions. Peter may not be able to hear you, so I think we'll have to repeat. So,
Peter, I was really interested in your view around breeding, having bees that are less productive than all the other things. Have you shared that message with commercial bee farmers? How does it land?
Yeah, so you told the story about how everyone should work together and so on. And the fact that we may have to work with slightly less productive colonies than perhaps a colonies on commercial systems. What is the response of commercial beekeepers to that idea?
Yeah, all right. So if you're a commercial beekeeper and your prime goal is to produce honey, that at least in Europe, primarily source of income is honey, and the other one is pollination jobs in whatever apple orchards and things like that. If your productivity is a key point, then of course you carry on with the most productive bees, but then you have to basically live with higher losses. And what is basically at the end of the day a trade-off scenario if it's about money and income? How much you're losing by losing colonies and how much you gain by more productive colonies? I think that's a question I cannot answer, because it depends on the income of individual beekeepers. You have to make your calculations, do your Excel, how much you earn, from the honey and how much you earn from pollination jobs, and then how much money you lose by having a certain proportion of colonies lost. So is it okay for you to have whatever 20% reduced productivity, but when you have 40% less losses, things like that? But that is something everybody has to see locally. And I don't want to give strict rules of things like that. Again, make your calculations. What is reduced productivity? Can you afford it if you compare that with the losses? But that's something, again, it's a question of money that everybody needs to answer herself, himself.
Roger, back. So Roger is saying that over the years he has removed many colonies from oak trees which have large cavities. And in this country, over the last sort of 10 years or so, we have ash dieback disease. There are fewer oak trees with large cavities in them, and instead we have ash trees with smaller cavities in them. Do you think the bees will adapt to smaller cavities?
A good question. The honest answer, I don't know. But in general, well, I worked in Africa for quite a few years. In Africa, the colonies usually are much smaller than they are in Europe. And so it may well, I think it actually may well be that bees are able to cope with smaller cavities. I think that's definitely feasible there. But I don't have a crystal ball working nicely. But I guess, yes, it will probably be possible. But I have no data. I cannot be sure here. But by looking at, other wild honeybee populations, also like in Latin America, the Africanized bees, colonies are usually much smaller. So I guess they can cope with smaller cavities. Also, there are like what we call in Afrikaans the krans bees. You know, there are cases in Southern Africa where the bees were open nesting, much like Apis dorsata is doing. You have on cliffs Apis mellifera is making open nesting. I've also seen that. So, and also I saw like not only hollow trees, but I saw in Africa holes in the ground. It remains a miracle how the bees surviving a heavy rainfall in the ground nest, but I saw it. So bees are not necessarily restricted to hollow trees. So them, and also like we're in Switzerland, we just made a survey over the past 2 years. There were like 308 colonies in a large survey, non-managed colonies in Switzerland. And in fact, more than half were in buildings. So buildings seem to be the much more preferred nesting site, at least in Switzerland. So yeah, with the trees, it could be, but I'm not 100% sure.
Peter, I think part of the question was also to what extent smaller colonies may be able to survive pest incidences better. So whether actually this is a positive spin-off.
Yeah, all right. I think I got that question. I think in general, colony size is important. So I used to show a picture of a colony with 2 brood rooms and 2 honey rooms. That was a beekeeping meeting in the Netherlands. And I called that, sorry, a bit brutally, Frankenstein's monster. Because in the wild, a colony will never have this size, never ever. If a colony has a certain size, it will swarm. And it will swarm again and even again and again, like they make after swarms. When a colony is very big, they swarm a lot. So yes, I think smaller colonies, at least in nature, tells us that smaller colonies are the ones preferred. The queens are probably less under stress because there's lack egg laying going on, and they may also have a better grip. And especially if they're also swarming. We don't want to swarm then. But if we can do a bit of artificial swarming in there, because these populations where the pests are less of an issue, again, Africa and Latin America, the colonies are extremely mobile. If you talk to beekeepers in South Africa, they have 10 swarms in their garden because the colonies basically come and go as they want. So I guess, yes, smaller colonies may be better able to deal with pests, yeah.
Any more questions? Jeff?
Of course, I welcome the COLOSS and the April Monday coming together. We're going to do that. But your point about bringing what I'll call them, the wild bee people into the picture and working more together, I think is critically important. That they need to quit ignoring the habitat destruction you pointed out, the pesticide exposure, and they need to get on board with so that we work together to provide more food, et cetera. So I welcome that comment about we need to get the wild bee people to not see the honeybee as an enemy. It's vital in agricultural production, and it's part of the natural ecosystem in Europe. So yeah, not so much a question, just thank you for that comment. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm basically, yeah, absolutely. I think it's actually really, it's detrimental if the managed honeybee community is having a battle with the nature conservationists. We are on the same side against these major stresses. And I guess there's really need for papers pointing this out, ideally, and also in high-ranking journals. And we should also run campaigns to say, all right, what are the main drivers we are facing? And both managed honeybees and wild pollinators are facing very the same. Pollination, lack of food, these are the key points, absolutely. I would be very happy to involve with Epimondia and with other people to trying also to get big grants to basically help all pollinators. That I think is really a very promising strategy instead of fighting against each other, absolutely, yeah.
Question at the back?
The happy Brazilian bees, as opposed to the very unhappy North American bees, is that just a one-off, or do you think that tells us something forward?
A general trend that the Africanized bees in Latin America are much better off health-wise compared to the North American honeybees. And in both cases, I think the Americas are a very good example, because only a handful of queens were brought from South Africa. I was at the apiary where the queens were reared to bring for that little experiment, which kind of resulted in the Africanized bees. So we have a genetic bottleneck. There were not many queens were brought over from Africa to Latin America, but nevertheless, the bees made it. And I believe it's like because there's an amazing high number of wild colonies in Latin America. Maybe 5% are kept by beekeepers and 95% are wild. And because of this and the managed and the wild population, the queens mate with males from the wild colonies, I think there is a much higher genetic diversity or much more diversity going on than in North America. And this is one of the reasons why we have males, is that, males are making a population more genetic diverse. So I guess it's yes, it's definitely a clear yes. The Latin American health situation is much better than the North American one. And I guess one of the reasons is probably that we're having an ample wild populations, very similar to Africa. So that the managed queens mating with males from wild colonies, and that at the end of the day results in that they can cope even with varroa much easier. There were reports in the South African Bee Journal when varroa made it into South Africa. That was in 1997-ish, 8-ish. And initially the beekeepers reported some issues with varroa, but only for a few years. And by now, talk to African beekeepers, there is no problem with varroa. So, and again, it's like something I'm worried about for many, many years now is we can carry on treating colonies forever. But if we want to have a sustainable solution that we just have to worry less, we should, I guess, really change things. And I don't claim to know like this how things go. We just stop treating. That is probably not feasible. But I guess it's time for a bit of a strategy that we are trying to treat less and less and less so that the colonies are better able to deal with it themselves. I guess there's at the end of the day no way out. And otherwise we are like in a hamster wheel. We have to treat again and again, and the treatments lose efficacy, and we have to have new treatments. So having less problems with varroa, that's the key, I guess. Less problems with varroa, we can go back to the happy days of beekeeping before varroa came. Anyhow, I guess that again, varroa and the mites, the viruses they transmit, we have to solve it. That is the key to all health issues, I guess, more or less. Any other questions, please?
I was just going to say, sort of on the subject of sort of commercial beekeepers and the way they manage things and so on, is one factor the rise of factories making fraudulent honey that isn't actually honey, which is being flooded on the world market and means that the international honey price is very low, and that therefore commercial beekeepers, because honey has a low value, are pushed into a sort of high input, high output system of beekeeping. And if we could sort of reduce the problem of fraudulent honey and honey price increase, then it would be possible to accept a lower input, lower output type of beekeeping. So do you think that's a contributory factor?
Yeah, it's that is an issue. I see it. And we also discussed that, for example, if you do lots of supplementary feeding, how can you ensure that your honey remains high quality? With all the completely messed up flowering of plants, are you guys able to get like pure whatever honey? So maybe oilseed rape in Germany, but because of these mix of flowering times, the pollen, the honey flows have completely mixed up. So getting pure honey is also more difficult. So, but it is feasible again. Like, Terje Reinhardsen in Oslo, he had like 200, 300 colonies and is doing extremely well. So yes, it is indeed possible to get colonies surviving varroa and be very productive. It is possible. Look at Terje Reinhardsen example, go to Oslo, look at the colonies, it is doable. And the point is, again, it is a bit risky because you may end up with Gotland bees no one wants to have, yeah? So it's not so easy, and you probably have to see what the colonies are doing in a certain area. But you also have isolated places in the UK. So start with it. I guess we really start with it. Make like a Swedish Gotland. And I had a word with a beekeeper from Graubünden in Switzerland last week. And he and me, we will start it in Switzerland. We're using in isolated valleys. We will have apiaries where we slow down varroa treatment to actually trying to achieve that. So it may not work so smoothly. and we may have a disaster, meaning like 10 colonies may die. But the same story was happening to Terje Reinhardsen. When he started, he initially lost a lot of colonies, 80% of his hives, 90% of his hives. But here over the last years, the last number I heard, from 300 colonies, he lost 5, which is a joke. So again, it's like something there's need for discussion. And I don't claim to know what is a proper strategy to deal with it, especially locally. So, but what might be worthy is, if you guys are interested, then we can carry on, kind of having a COLOSS workshop, or people, the beekeepers and scientists who are interested in, we could try to develop like a joint strategy for UK beekeeping. If for more resilient or more sustainable UK beekeeping, we could try to start an initiative, and we could also think about fundraising from government or from private foundations. But that's something happening. But otherwise, we carry on treating varroa for the next 30 years.
Right, do we have any last questions? If not, then I think we better let Peter go. And thank him once again for speaking to us.
Thank you very much, everybody. It was my great pleasure. Yeah.